Hello there, Rule the Galaxy fans. This is Jessica, and we're here with episode 194 of Rule the Galaxy. And today we have a real special treat. We're joined by author Stephen Kent, who is the author of How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. And we're so excited to have you, Stephen, to be able to talk all about Star Wars and the conversations that it contributes to about our
the
daily
discourse, the discourse,
all the discourse. So
Yes.
many questions, so many things to talk about. And but then in between that, we'll talk about just Star Wars in general. I know that you said that you're not quite up on everything that's been happening in the Bad Batch, but we'll talk generally. I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the the more recent things that Star Wars has been exploring, the different eras in terms of politics. So I think that we're gonna have fun tonight.
I think so too. Thank you so much for having me, Jessica, and Rule the Galaxy listeners. It's nice to talk to you all again. It's been a hot minute. I think maybe at least a year. So nice to be back.
Were you on after your book had been released?
Yeah, I'd have to search my memory, but yes, I have been on Rule the Galaxy before, but it has been a little while.
Well, good. This is the first time that I'm talking to you. I just finished your book literally about 10 minutes ago, listening on I think 3 times the speed on Audible.
What is that like? Is that just like listening to a Ben Shapiro rap video or something?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you get really good at listening for the keywords.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but no, I thought that it was just wonderful. If we got listeners out there who you really do enjoy thinking about politics and culture and religion and how those kinds of conversations that we see in our daily life are can be contributed by the media that we consume. I definitely recommend that you check out this book. It is available on Audible, or you can get the physical copy. I just kind of wanted to ask you, Stephen, a little bit about the writing of this book. And the one thing that I wanted to ask is, through the book, you kind of go through kind of looking at different I guess you can call them virtues that you kind of assign to different characters. So there's like the first chapter I know is like Padme and humility and things like that. And I'm just kind of curious, when was that something that you had always thought about? Had you always had this idea of like tying certain characters to certain virtues, or was that something that came later in the process?
Yeah, a little bit later in the process, actually. So as I was sort of ideating, the book that became How the Force Can Fix the World, I knew that I wanted to tell a story about why Star Wars matters to political conversation, why it underpins sort of, Western culture's idea of good and evil. Since 77, this is just something that's unavoidable. And I don't remember exactly when I sort of decided on a virtues guide, where the book takes us through what I believe are the most important 7 virtues of Star Wars that apply to democratic life. So living in the free world, what are things that you can get from Star Wars that matter? They're humility, empathy, courage, hope, redemption, balance, and choice or free will. And it wasn't actually till I had just a DMs conversation with Star Wars podcaster Brian Young about from Full of Sith. And we were just talking very briefly about Padme and Boss Nass. And he sort of like opened my eyes to how that interaction between Padme and Boss Nass on Naboo, where she kneels before him and sort of humbles herself before him and the Gungans, that it was a masterclass in humility, and that kind of display actually has like a lot of moral worth. And it kind of hit me, and I was like, oh, like that is right. That is right. Why did Padme kneel before Boss Nass? What is about her leadership style that is interesting? And I was like, oh, she's a child queen. Is it just children who think like this? Is it only young people who would be able to humble themselves before a rival like that? And they just led me down a wormhole. And, seven chapters later, I had a book on Star Wars virtues that relate to politics. And that's how the Force can fix the world.
Love it. If you were able to make the book longer, going beyond these 7 virtues, are there any other characters that you kind of would have liked to focus on?
Well, I'm trying to think about who I did focus on, because number one's humility was a focus on Padme. Then the second chapter on empathy zeroed in on 2 characters, that of Kylo Ren, and then a little bit on Qui-Gon Jinn. Uh, Fear versus courage is kind of all about Anakin Skywalker. Redemption is, of course, sort of about your bad guys in Star Wars, Kylo Ren and Darth Vader. And then choice, free will, was all about Rey. I'm not really sure what character or what virtue I feel like got left on the cutting room floor. I remember that there was going to be a chapter about like Star Wars and foreign policy and like, war and peace. And as the book sort of drifted away from being a very explicitly political book, where it was going to originally be about how to think about taxes, how to think about war and peace, how to think about free speech. It then drifted more towards the moral universe. So I don't have a great answer to your question on that, but I do feel like I very happily covered every trilogy. And that was something that I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on from a lot of fans who appreciate the absolutism of how the Force can fix the world. It's not just original trilogy worship. It spends a lot of time in the prequels. It starts in episode 1. And so like some readers, I went on Glenn Beck's radio show to talk about the book, and he was just making fun of me to my face, because he's like, I wanted to read this book in its entirety, and it starts in episode 1. And the Gungans, like, are you trying to make me close this book? And it's like, well, I love all of Star Wars, and I also spent time in the sequel trilogy with Rey and Kylo, so it's pretty well rounded, I think. But
It is.
it
I would have.
did get some hate for that.
I suppose I
Yeah.
would have liked to see a little bit more Clone Wars and
I
those kinds of
know.
things, because I think that Clone Wars is just rife with the political
And that was
emphasis.
mostly a publisher decision,
I figured.
because what we were really torn on was, if you want to get into the weeds of like the politics of Star Wars, particularly public policy, Clone Wars is like
Yeah.
your go-to. The movies are really not a great go-to source for political policy and opinion. Like it's really about the moral nexus of the galaxy. And there's a little bit, of course, in episodes 1 and 2 that relates to control and politics and representation. But the Clone Wars is where you go for all of that kind of stuff. And we made a calculated decision that if you were going to speak to the broader public about Star Wars in a political way, you had to stick to the things that they have seen. And I had to remind myself, like the Clone Wars, Rebels, animated series, that is much more niche in terms of Star Wars reach. But I do regret not getting to The Mandalorian. And I was probably already done with like 75% of the book by the time Mandalorian was really getting popular. And I wish that I had dedicated a chapter to Grogu and Din Djarin, and that this is the way. I mean, like that is a chapter name. It was just a real missed opportunity.
Yeah, I did figure that was probably the reason why you kind of shied away from that. I've mentioned before that I also work in publishing, and I've been part of conversations related to those kinds of things where it's like you really got to play to what your audience knows. And in this case, when you put out this kind of stuff, you kind of have to stay away from that, which is a real problem for me, because I swear I could write a dissertation on Mandalorian pacifism in the Clone Wars, and that's what.
Yeah, there was a tough choice to make in the redemption chapter on, and I didn't know what Star Wars message would be for how to solve redemption in our society. So I looked at 2 issues that are in the culture: criminal justice reform and prisons. How we think about how we treat people who make mistakes, and reintegrate them into society. And then, the cancel culture thing. So, witch hunts, whether or not people can, mess up, say bad things, and then bounce back from it and still have a public life. So I wanted to tackle those two things. And I was like, all right, what does Star Wars have to say about this? Star Wars is a redemption story. It is about how people go to the darkest of dark and come back. It's about space Nazis becoming good again and coming back to the light. These are great things to argue. But I wasn't sure how Star Wars would lend its wisdom to these real world problems. And it was in the Clone Wars that I found the answer. And so there's only one chapter in which I deviated from the films, and it was to the conclusion of Clone Wars when Yoda goes and meets in the Force realm with the Wills to discover how to become a Force ghost and how to live on after death, so that he can commune with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan and the likes later in Star Wars. So that was something that, in terms of the canon, was so important to explain to people in the book. You misunderstand how Force ghosting works. And if I clear this up for you, then we can clarify how Star Wars can solve the redemption problem in society. And it's all about conquering your hubris.
Okay, now with that, with that moment of talking about Yoda and the Wills and the fact that he has to fight his dark side, I just have one little piece of beef that I want to bring up with you.
Okay.
Because I think that you and I would have very different views on the idea, the Jedi's idea of balance. And I think that this actually trickles down into a lot of different things, including relating to the sequel trilogy, which I know that you have a very favorable view to. And for me, I won't even talk about issues of characterization and even politics and those kinds of things. But for me, I'm surprised that you did look at Yoda fighting his dark side, but then kind of I think that you do characterize the Jedi's view of balance as skewed, correct? I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's right. The Jedi were ultimately wiped off the map by the Sith and the Empire because they were an order out of balance with what was actually the will of the Force. Yoda in that scene in the Clone Wars where he fights his shadow self. I mean, this is, I think, most tied to the Jungian concept, Carl Jung, the psychologist of the 20th century, about conquering your shadow self. It's your dark side, it's your passions, some of it maybe your caged wants and desires. It's very heady kind of stuff, but this is the idea that once you have recognized what your dark side is, you see that it is real, and you acknowledge that it is an equal part of you, not an alien force, not like Cloud Frollo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, who has like a lust issue, and he views his lust issue as an external force like demons or temptation that is being foisted upon him. But whereas you see those things as part of you, that you are responsible for them, and then you must conquer them and show responsibility. Like, that is the path for the Jedi to eternal life, not caging the dark side, but seeing it as an equal part of themselves and then controlling it. That's the ultimate balancing act. I do think the Jedi were, of course, an out of balance order. The idea that they were going to bring balance to the Force by destroying the Sith, the practitioners of the dark side, that's not balance, that's domination.
Okay,
What's your take on that?
As a Christian, I read it I read a theological kind of view of balance having totally to do with what we would call original sin. And this is something that for me, the idea of destroying the Sith is not a form of domination when they are evil. There is no balance of light and dark if the dark is selfishness. Balance is found when the dark does not exist. But we also know that the dark continues to exist because it exists inside of us. And that's something that as Christians, we affirm that there is that element of there's darkness inside us, and we have to, you know, I mean, there's the verse in Genesis about Cain and Abel where God literally tells Cain that sin crouches like a wolf at your door and you have to defeat it. And there's a passage in let me see if I have it here in you know, I'm not sure if you read the novels or whatnot, but I always had this feeling.
Some of them I do, yeah.
Have you read Master and Apprentice?
I'm halfway through it.
Oh, okay. Well, I wonder if you've seen this part yet, but this I had found, and it was a real confirmation of what I already thought about this particular issue. But it says, the Jedi don't have such mystics anymore, Obi-Wan pointed out. We're meant to put aside visions of the future because we can't know whether they'll come to pass. Master Yoda even says such visions can bring a Jedi to darkness. Yes, seeking to know the future can be a form of control, which can lead to the dark side, Qui-Gon said in his deep, resonant voice. From his tone, Obi-Wan knew his master had heard all of this from Yoda many times before. And learning the forms of lightsaber combat is a way of preparing for violence. Violence, too, can lead to the dark side. We are entrusted with great diplomatic power, which means we exert influence over many systems. I understand what you mean, Obi-Wan said. Many paths can lead to the dark side. As Jedi, we possess power that average beings do not and never will. Holding power over other beings will always require us to be vigilant against the darkness within us. Our ability to sometimes glimpse potential futures is no more or less dangerous than any of our other talents. And so, you know, that idea of like darkness within us, for me, I think that the Jedi's view of balance absolutely is the correct view, because the only way that you can create some kind of blank slate, some kind of wiping clean of the darkness, is to destroy it where it's been given free reign. We can't destroy ourselves, we can't destroy each and every person, but that darkness still does exist within us, and it's the fight within each and every person to decide, you know, that idea of like, which of the wolves inside you are you going to feed? So for me, I think that, like, I mentioned that I had a much different take on the sequel trilogy, and a lot of that trickles down from that, because for me, I saw Last Jedi and I hated Last Jedi. I hated it so much, and it's never gotten any better.
I'm sorry.
I know, you know, like you mentioned, I'm not sure if it was in the book or in the podcast part after the book on the audio version, that you talk about, you know, I think that every Star Wars fan has had one of those moments. And I think that it's funny because in terms of the sequels, it's one or the other usually. It's either you had that moment in Last Jedi or you had it in Rise of Skywalker. So you know what? We're all united on that front. But for me, I saw Last Jedi as really kind of giving in more to the idea of like, there needs to be dark and light. It's more of this dualistic type of idea that, to me, I look at that, and as someone with 2 degrees in Christian history, I look at that and I'm like, dualism, that's a heresy.
Yeah, no, he wants to join the conversation.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just to jump in real quick here. I kind of agree with what you're saying about the skewed view of balance in the prequels versus the sequels. And you kind of going off of what Jessica was saying here, you look at like in episode 1, when the Jedi Council was confronted with the possibility of there being a Sith, they said there's no way that could happen without us knowing. Whereas in The Last Jedi, when Rey shows up in Snoke's chambers or his throne room or whatever, he says, I told my apprentice, as you got stronger, someone from the light side would get stronger as well.
Darkness rises and light to meet it.
Right. Yeah. So to me, that was more of a accurate portrayal or belief in balance, that the more powerful you get in dark, a equal or more powerful person is going to rise on the light.
Yes, to defeat it.
Right. But rather than in the prequels where they just said, no, that can't be, because we are all knowing and nothing can happen without us.
Yeah, but you do know that the whole point of the prequels is that Palpatine was literally like making it so that they couldn't sense
having daily meetings with the Dark Lord of the Sith, who was already plotting to take over the entire universe. Yeah.
Yes, which is why they were tricked, and they were tricked into a game that was being played by one person. It's like Palpatine, Palpatine is basically that Pixar short of the guy playing chess with himself in the park, Jerry's game,
Yes.
where he just
I
flips it around on himself?
I
So the
completely agree.
So
But
the
when your
idea of
opponent doesn't believe that you can exist, it also makes it a lot easier.
This is
yeah, but they don't believe that the Sith can't exist. They just had no idea that they were being shielded from knowing that they did
Right.
exist.
I
So
think
that's not them having a skewed view of balance. That's them using their senses in order to sense the Sith, not being able to sense them, and then parsing that through the ideas that they already had. If I told you there's a purple ghost behind you, and you said, no, I don't sense a purple ghost behind me, that doesn't make any sense to me. And I said, but there is, that doesn't make you wrong or arrogant for not believing me. It means that you have a different perspective that
I mean, I'm pretty
isn't
sure that
carrying that out.
Yoda, I don't know in which property he did this. It was either the Clone Wars or Rebels when he had a conversation with Ezra, but he has admitted to ego and hubris and arrogance blinding the Jedi Order to the threats that were rising all around them, that they were just completely unable to see past their own noses. So, there's the thing that's really tough here is always looking at how do I view morality and the moral universe in the world that we live versus like what story is Star Wars telling. And that's always tough to kind of segregate, because Star Wars is absolutely just this sort of worldly, like, take the best of the Stoics and the best of Buddhism and a little bit of Judeo-Christian, wisdom, and just blend it all together, and you sort of just get this sort of hodgepodge dualism type space religion. And I do believe that the Star Wars view of balance, or at least the Jedi view of balance, got to be to a point where the Sith could not operate in the galaxy. Dark side, practitioners were not allowed to function, and their view of balance was that the light is dominant across the galaxy. Now, the problem with making room for it is, and this was going to be the foreign policy chapter that I never wrote, was that when you allow darkness to exist, it festers, it grows, it is a cancer. The nature of the dark side is hunger, want, and greed. It is self-satisfaction, and self-satisfaction only snowballs, it only grows. So if you allow the dark side to exist without some sort of external force suppressing it, it will grow to be out of your control.
Then why do you think that the view is skewed? Because to me,
Mhm.
it all comes down to how, it's when people look at the Jedi destroying the Sith, bringing balance.
Mhm.
To me, it makes absolute total sense. You have to destroy the evil that exists. So in your view, what is a view of balance that the Jedi should have espoused instead?
I don't know. I mean, I think the place where Luke was at in The Last Jedi, where he's talking to Rey on the island about the nature of the light and the dark side as it pertains to like the circle of life, and pain and death and life and warmth and cold on the island, all of those things sort of living in symbiosis, this sort of very Eastern hippy dippy kind of a view of what the Force all is, that it is all valid and it is all real, it is all the Force. Like that, I think, is the ideal, the Star Wars moral ideal. It's very similar in a lot of ways to the way Avatar: The Last Airbender talks about balance in the universe. I don't know if I have a great answer for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just definitely stuff to think about. I mean, my thoughts on Last Jedi is, that part specifically is that, that reminds me of the Bible verse where it's like, for everything there's a season. Like there is balance, but for me, I don't see those things as one and the same. The view of balance in terms of good and evil versus the balance of the way that life works. I view those as two very different realms, where I think that the reason why I disliked Last Jedi is it tries to make those two one and the same. And to
Yeah.
me, it's like, well, death itself isn't evil.
Are
And
you
even
telling me that our society thinks you can have your cake and eat it too? Like that's where our culture is at. Like basically our the arbiters of our high culture basically want to tell everybody you can do whatever feels good as long as you don't hurt people. You know, everything's good. You can have everything that you want, be anyone who you want to be. And that's very much how you get to the gray Jedi ideal in Star Wars being realized in the sequel trilogy. And that's why the gray Jedi concept was always so popular, because most people want to be a little bit of everything. And so they don't want to sign up for the
oh,
Sith character, the Jedi character. They want to be interesting. And an interesting person is a little bit of both. You know what I mean? Like it's just kind of blasé and boring, but people think it's interesting.
I guess I understand that. I would also point out that Grey Jedi are not canon at all.
No, but they always were in the headcanon, I think, of your average fan. The Gray Jedi became in the early 2000s like a thing that people talked about, and it was realized in the sequel trilogy, but not by name.
But that's my problem with it. That's why I didn't like it, because for me, I look at that and I go, if the dark side is selfishness, if the dark side is giving into those things that are not good, then I look at that and I go, it doesn't matter if you're 99% good and 1% bad or 50-50. The presence of that darkness isn't better than if it's not there. And it's different from saying something like, oh, if you're just 100% good, like take the person, whoever you think the best Jedi is, who represents the light side.
Qui-Gon Jinn.
Great. just because he represents all that is good doesn't mean that, for example, he doesn't take care of himself. I think that some people get this idea of like, oh, well, if you're completely and totally selfless, then you like a person can't live that way. Well, no, self-care is just as much selfless, because you are making it possible for yourself to continue to sacrifice for others. So the idea of like, oh, taking care of yourself, not thinking of others, like that's not selfish, that's just self-care, but it makes you able to continue a lifestyle that is self-sacrificial, but it's still representative of only being in the light. And that's the thing, is that like it's the pursuit of the light, knowing that we have darkness in us, but continually choosing every single day to not indulge it. And there's I guess I don't want to read this quote, because the other quote from Master and Apprentice, that is kind of the one that's
read it.
You think so?
Yeah, read
it. Let me see. So this is near the end, and it's kind of the quote that the book is known for, and I just think it's my favorite quote of any books, and maybe even of the saga itself. It says, "It matters which side we choose, even if there will never be more light than darkness, even if there can be no more joy in the galaxy than there is pain. For every action we undertake, for every word we speak, for every life we touch, it matters. I don't turn toward the light because it means someday I'll win some sort of cosmic game. I turn toward it because it is the light." And that's Qui-Gon.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah.
That's Qui-Gon.
No, it's Qui-Gon's the best. Yeah. What were you going to say?
No, that's just I for me, like I just read that and I go like that's it. That's the essence of Star Wars, especially as you're reading it in light of. I mean,
we always think about Star
it's
Wars as being like centrally planned by Lucasfilm and the story group and all that kind of stuff. And it's so interesting to me that Star Wars cranks out sort of like competing views like within itself of like really what the Force is about, and that's because we're talking about different characters. Qui-Gon is not Luke Skywalker, and you may have, like, of course, a different writer, like, Claudia Gray, like writing Master and Apprentice, and a different person coming up with the mythology of The Last Jedi. But I like to believe that does ultimately all run through like a couple of people who decide this is appropriate for Star Wars and this isn't. And it's all there. Like it's a very, very wide moral universe with a lot of different philosophers operating in the galaxy who have different views. And Qui-Gon in that quote, like I resonate with that. I think that's absolutely true. And that they're searching for the truth of what the Force is, just like we're in this world trying to search for the truth of our existence in God. And we debate about it. We and we disagree all the time. I think of this issue in Star Wars of balance as being where the Jedi and the Sith are practicing religions, where they have a very totaling view of what is and is not valid for you to practice to live a fulfilling life. The Sith believe in self-indulgence at all times. The dark side, do whatever feels good and it will make you powerful. It will break your chains and make you free. And the Jedi are really practicing, I think really like this sort of stoic abstinent ideal of not recognizing and dealing with, but like suppressing emotion and abstaining from certain things so that you don't then have to deal with temptation. And I think the balance is usually found in recognizing that the negative emotions, the pain, the wants, the lust, the things that you might feel, that they are not alien outside forces, they are part of you. And as soon as you recognize that, then you can start to deal with it in a constructive way rather than in a blamey sort of way. And I think that's sort of what tricks people into falling into the dark when they're able to shirk responsibility for the darkness within them. I don't know if that makes any sense the way I articulated it, but when we stop thinking of the dark side as an outside alien force and equal to us, then we're able to conquer it. And I don't think that's what the Jedi did.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that in general, Alfie?
No, I'm just sitting here listening to you two. This is great.
This is the most in-depth interview I've ever gotten on this. So this is fantastic. Jessica Johnson has won the game.
Yes.
The last time I was on here with Jessica and an author, I was out of it too because she's just great at this.
Oh, you're so sweet. I will also mention, I really appreciate you are the first person to bring up what always gets missed in the conversation about the moment in Revenge of the Sith, where Anakin says, either you're with me or you're my enemy, and Obi-Wan says only a Sith deals in absolutes. And everybody 20 years ago and today, it's all a postmodernism thing, and I just it drives me nuts, because yes, postmodernism was kind of a buzzword, especially for conservatives 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But it's not about that. And you bring it to the political roots, which is Bush saying you're either with us or you're against us. And in this political sphere. And to me, that's the essence of that moment, because it is not about making it some kind of philosophical statement about there can't be any absolutes. It's about saying there's so much more gray than you're either for us or against us. There has to be this recognition that I don't agree with you, but I still love you. And Anakin's inability to be able to see that Obi-Wan still loves him, still supports him, but cannot stand with him in this moment. I think that's even more applicable now when you talk about things like cancel culture and this world where we're so willing to divide ourselves into these spaces that say you're either for my side or you're actively working against my side.
That's because we're having this cultural debate right now about truth, identity, and validation. And we are in this peak moment of live your truth as sort of the cultural good. And what that requires, and I'm going to try to put this in the way that I would like, is that when we hold up as a societal good that people should live their version of the truth or live their truth, they are going to move through the world, and their opinions about themselves, their opinions about things outside of them, their view of their identity and what they are, it becomes them. Their view of the world becomes who they are, because they are living their truth. And so then when you attack somebody's opinion and you're having a debate about somebody's views, or you question somebody's supposed identity of whatever kind, like whether, it's like their class, their race, their gender, whatever, you attack their anything, you are attacking them. And when we roll up all of our views and our truth and our political opinions, they become inseparable. And so then you just get this total war situation where we used to have political debates, but I wasn't debating your humanity. I was saying
Exactly.
that you are wrong about taxes. I wasn't debating your humanity. I was just saying these books don't belong in these schools. And now they're all intertwined, because we are not debating issues. We're debating what people think are like their existence. And it didn't used to be that way. So we have to be wondering, like, what changed in the culture that now we're debating that.
Well, and I really appreciate this book because I like that you do kind of lay out where your own allegiances lie. Just in bits and pieces, we get, little moments where you let the audience know, what you identify as in terms of your
A
political or
libertarian.
religious
Yeah.
belief. Yep.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that, like, we can kind of come to this book on that footing. There are, like, for me, I was raised in a very conservative home. I was raised as an evangelical Christian and still identify in that way. Went to 2 evangelical schools, which ironically actually kind of pushed me way far liberal in a way that my parents never expected. And so what I think is really interesting is that there's a lot in your book that, I mentioned this before we started recording, that, like, I read the book and
Mhm.
could just feel like, okay, this is a person who thinks about the world in very, very similar ways that I do. And yet there were still many, many times where, like, I looked at a way that you described a certain cultural
Mhm.
touchstone, and, definitely in my view would have really pushed back against the way that you described it. There's tons of differences. It's
Good.
all about whether, yeah, exactly. It's all about whether or not we can come to these conversations and say, we have different views. We all have a reason for those views. Where can we find the common ground and the common good as we sort through them? And I just don't know what we can do to, I don't want to have a look back 20 years ago, or even, just kind of the pre-social media
Mhm.
days, and just say, oh, can we just get back to that? I mean, there were divides back then too. I mean, you self-sort by reading different newspapers. Even before cable news, that was an issue. I mean, even I, as a historian, I know that, I mean, this was something that was being done in the Revolutionary War. Different newspapers would crop up, and
Yeah. The
we can
partisan
see
press. Yeah.
the partisan press.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a natural thing. But how do we get back to a place where we're at least able to, I guess, tolerate each other enough to be able to have these conversations on ground that doesn't resort to your disagreement undermines my identity?
Mhm. Yeah, I don't know. I think the chapter on balance was my attempt to get at that a little bit. And it is all about making space for people to live out, um, I don't want to say live out their truths, but live out their versions of the good. And we do have a constitutional order in this country that allows for such things to exist. The problem is that power has become so centralized in our country, particularly in the past 100 years, where we are now in a constant all against all conflict to get control of the Death Star, being Washington, D.C., the White House, the Supreme Court, where, if we have an election, a wave election that goes in one way, people feel like their lives are under threat. We've seen it in every election, at least for the past 4 cycles, where all chill is lost. And that shouldn't be the case. Like, we should really have very little care about who ends up in the White House or on the Supreme Court. But because the power has gotten to be so great, gosh, I mean, like, you feel like the rebels, knowing that the Death Star is coming into your star system. It is either we storm the cockpit in the Flight 93 analogy, or we take out the Death Star immediately in self-defense. And that's what happens when you have massive power being pointed at your direction. So I hate to like make the classical small c conservative or libertarian point, but the only way to turn down the temperature is to dismantle the pieces of the Death Star that people find so threatening. If Trump were to get reelected again in 2024, the only way to limit his power is to make the federal government powerless. And that should be what we want. I do believe that one day we are going to go more towards a very decentralized federalist system, maybe even like a city-state type system in the future. I think that that's going to come back. Mark my words.
I mean, what else can you do when you've already got people calling for civil war? I mean, I think that, reading your book was kind of an interesting thing because it's so recent. And yet I spent a lot of time going, I wonder what he would put in here if it was updated for 2023.
Yeah.
And, when we're dealing with a war between Russia and Ukraine, we're dealing with our political divides, which in America have placed different people on different sides of the Russia-Ukraine issue.
Mm-hmm.
We've got people who are literally calling for a national divorce. And I kind of go, it as a historian, it reawakens the question in my mind that I've always had related to Star Wars, which is Star Wars more like the American Revolutionary War, or is it more like the American Civil War? Because they're two very different things depending on the way that you view the separatists and their views. For me, I look at it and I go, the separatists complained all of the time that they weren't having representation in the Senate, and that because they were so far away from the core worlds, they also weren't reaping the benefits of being part of the Republic.
Yep.
And so to me, I look at it and I go, to me, it sounds more like a Revolutionary War type issue of no taxation without representation and wanting to have their own identity. Whereas, now it kind of brings up more parallels in terms of, well, if you are a united republic, whatever that looks like, then what do you do when half of your republic wants to separate? And these are questions. It struck me that you drew a parallel to growing up in the early 2000s and how the prequels were premiering at the same time that all of these same questions were being asked. This idea of a Congress being willing to give their leader all of these emergency powers, of a war that was based on a lie, and all of these things, and I just wonder, is it going to become that relevant again?
Have you ever in the early, so because you mentioned the early 2000s and I just finished it for the 4th time tonight, have you ever watched the early 2000s show Jericho starring Skeet Ulrich?
No.
Yes.
So Jericho is from like 2005, I think, just sort of like in the heat of the war on terror and the war on Iraq. This is like a CW type show. I mean, it's like the same kind of production quality as Gilmore Girls. It was network television, but it was a show that takes place in Kansas, a little kind of conservative town, and then all of the major US cities are all blown up in nuclear attacks. And so this town in Kansas is trying to figure out how to survive in the wake of the devastation, reorder society, all this kind of stuff. Over the course of the show, there's only 2 seasons because it was canceled. You find out that military contractors, mercenary companies, which we're very familiar with from the Iraq War and Afghanistan, colluded with corporations to basically form a government of their own, corporations backed by military contractors to attack the United States and then become the new government. It was the ultimate corporatism Inc. show. And it was cast as conservative, red state Americans like fighting back against corporations in the middle of the Iraq war. Like this show was it was so before its time because it was speaking to the same thing that George Lucas was talking about in the prequels with the Trade Federation and corporatism. But the Republican Party was still very much the party of Mitt Romney and Bain Capital and Wall Street at that time in the early 2000s. Fast forward 20 years, the divorce is completely been worked out in the Trump era, and now Republicans are very woke about corporatism and that there is a genuine threat to the constitutional order from Wall Street. And that's a very interesting change. And when I think about like the prequels and the Trade Federation and the separatists, it just sort of reframes the entire subject for me. I've grown more and more sympathetic to the separatists over time.
Yeah, I think that I'm the same, where like I really appreciate the very few moments in the Clone Wars where we get looks into the separatists with Mina Bonteri and Lux Bonteri. But then specifically, and I find a way to mention her every time I come on. Satine is my girl, and so for me, there's a moment in the Clone Wars that does not get talked about ever, but it is the most important moment, and it's the fact that Satine on a neutral Mandalore actually brings together Republican separatist representatives with the intent of having peace talks, and these actually are officially sanctioned, including by the Senate and thus by Palpatine, which is really interesting when you think of like she's working toward negotiation that actually could make a difference. And it is so quick. It's literally like the first 2 minutes of an episode that doesn't even relate to that topic. But I think that that idea of just really trying to emphasize that there are ways other than war that can result in the outcomes that you want. You mentioned in the book, I can't remember exactly what the wording is, but that politics is arduous. When it's working properly, politics is a lot of compromise, it's a lot of concession, it's a lot of people leaving the negotiating table not being happy.
It's unsatisfying.
It's unsatisfying. And Anakin doesn't like that. Anakin is the one who says that we should just have somebody who arbitrates everything. And Padme says, like, who's going to do that? You?
Anakin's the everyman.
Yeah.
Like most people, I don't know when you realized this, Jessica, but I realized it after January 6th that I should reevaluate the assumption that most of my neighbors just love democracy. Like why would they, why would they, especially if like every election they feel like their lives are being upended or threatened. Most people would prefer quote unquote stability, regular order, things being predictable. That is like the human condition. What we do here in the United States is actually really, really radical, where we just allow the flipping of the table every couple of years. But it is part of what makes us free. Anakin, I now accept as being like a pretty normal person who goes, yeah, like I would actually just prefer to get everybody together in one room and have a wise and enlightened individual. Like George Lucas mentioned that he would prefer a benevolent despot, sort of showing his cards as well, that would be a good way to run a society. I think most people feel that way. They just assume it will be one of their people.
and that's the problem. That's the problem, is that I think that you're absolutely right, that people don't actually like democracy. And I think that what we've seen on
100%
both sides of the aisle, but to me, I see it a lot on the Republican side, is that there's been a lot of people who have paid a lot of lip service to democracy, but as soon as they start to feel that they're losing cultural capital, then
Mhm.
that push towards authoritarianism is very strong. And
Mhm.
so for me, I I think that I have a good ability to see both sides. Like I said, I was raised in a really conservative home. I understand the ideas, like the reasoning why people hold conservative ideals. Personally, I consider myself to be like, if in a perfect world, I would be a libertarian, but I don't
Mhm.
think that it actually can be borne out in the real
Mhm.
world. And so for me, I skew more liberal now because I think that there are things that we need to address that hasn't been addressed.
Are you like a social democrat?
I just really can't figure out what my label is.
That's okay.
Um, but for me, it's all about integrity. And again, I'm going to bring it back to my girl Satine, because I think that if I would have been writing your book,
Mhm.
I would have had, and if I could have, dove into the Clone Wars, I would have done a chapter on Satine and integrity,
Mhm.
because it's her that I think she's the one who's willing to rise above those partisan politics, and she's the one. There's a line in the first episode that she appears in where she and Obi-Wan are talking, and Obi-Wan, they're debating about what a peacekeeper is, and Obi-Wan says a peacekeeper belongs on the front lines of conflict, otherwise he couldn't do his job, and obviously that represents his own
Yeah.
experience. And then she says the work of a peacekeeper is to make certain that conflict doesn't arise, and he says that
Mm.
that's a noble description, but it's not a realistic one. And she says, is reality what makes a Jedi abandon his ideals, or is it only a response to political convenience?
Oh, that's so good.
And
That
that's
is
where
that's so good.
that to me, I have used that line
Yeah.
in political debates because for me, it's all about integrity. Do you say you love democracy, or do you just love it when your party is in power? Do you just like the voting, and are you oh shoot,
No,
the
I I'm
I am just blanking on the issue of the electoral college. That's the word.
right.
Do you just find yourself for or against the electoral college based on whether or not it helps your side, or do you actually have a reason behind why you think the electoral college should exist? Because
Yeah.
I have yet to find someone who finds themselves firmly on one side of the political debate
Yeah, we were
who.
having no conversation about reforming the Supreme Court until Bader Ginsburg died, and Kavanaugh ended up on the court as well, like all in the course of like 2 years. The Democrats like leap over themselves to, oh, we need to expand the size of the court. Oh, and then in the Atlantic and the Washington Post, we also need pieces saying why the Senate needs to be dissolved. Like, real takes that like just came out of a political threat.
Mhm.
Our power is threatened. What if we were to dissolve the Senate as an institution? These are conversations you have when you're losing.
Yep.
Yeah. And we should all be able to like see through it and go, yeah, like these institutions, these political parties, they change the rules when they're losing. And we should be able to like name it, shame it, see it.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's all about power.
So then in that, especially when it comes to our leaders, I think about, well, first off, I think that there is something to be said on the difficulty when we're in situations like with COVID. So many people on the conservative side saying that the government overstepped boundaries, other people on the left saying that they didn't go far enough. I do think that there needs to be some humility in terms of recognizing that. I just look at leaders who are faced with making those decisions, and I
Mhm.
don't envy them at all. You are
Yeah.
never going to make everybody happy. A governor trying to make rules for his or her state is never going to make everybody happy in terms of living in an urban environment versus a rural environment. So, I think that we really need to have some humility when it comes to just not knowing. But when it comes to those leaders, you make a couple mentions in the book, regarding the media, politics, and the politics of fear. And the fact that so many politicians, regardless of what side you're on, they market in fear because that's what gets the outrage. That's what gets the support. That's what gets people rallied together. So my question is, can leaders have integrity? And can politicians actually exist in ways that don't deny the reality of a situation, but also don't fearmonger and lead people into cycles of outrage?
Well, I mean, I think of Barack Obama as being a pretty great example of a person who rolled into the White House not once but twice on the hope message and on raising the bar. And he of course, like any politician, like slipped into moments of polarizing and pointing fingers at thems and theys and all that. But like he was the "we are not red and blue America, we are one America" guy, and he was the hope and change candidate who elevated the conversation. I lived through it. I was there, and now we're living in the years after, and you go, okay, like that was the last taste of that kind of politics we're going to get for a while. So the answer is, of course, yes. That is possible, but it is incredibly unnatural, and I don't think intuitive for what politics is all about. The incentive structure in our culture, and again with media right now, is to drive fear, polarization, and negative polarization. So getting people excited about what they're against more than what they're for. And that is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. This is the way that our information economy is being actively designed and built every single day by moneyed interests. And I never thought that I would use language like that because, I come from the right and I'm supposed to love moneyed interests. But like, we're 10, 15 years into this social experiment, and we see how this is going. And that's the way that it is. So I always try to like come back to like a Star Wars example when I'm talking about this stuff, so I don't get too lost in the news cycle. But the fear chapter is all about how much are you willing to just let go of control when you have a bad feeling about something. There are two prime examples in Star Wars of where fear ends up harming a Jedi or setting them off their path. Of course, it's Anakin Skywalker and his visions of death, his mother, and then Padme, and then him doing, whatever is needed, including killing the younglings to save Padme from death. And then it's Luke Skywalker, a little bit less dramatic, but he wants to save Han and Leia from suffering on Cloud City in Episode 5 when he's training to be a Jedi with Yoda and Dagobah. And, Yoda tries to tell him, always in motion the future is, you can't actually predict these things. It might be that the dark side is just, in your head, kind of, tricking you and all this kind of stuff. He didn't say that, of course, but the point was you don't know what's going to happen. It turns out a lot of times it's self-fulfilling prophecy. People's fears and then their rashness in their desire to control things and stop bad things from happening creates the bad thing that they were afraid of. And then they can always blame someone else. They can always blame other people for why it went wrong. Luke, of course, leaves his training early and he goes and loses his hand. And Han was already shipped off in carbonite, and Leia was fine. So his dark side vision of a bad future was wrong. He probably should have done nothing. He should have stayed on Dagobah.
He should have stayed there. He should have finished his training. And like, yeah, I don't think that gets brought up enough. That I think that everybody looks at it like, oh, he did the right thing going there. It's like, I love that you mentioned that. No, things would have been fine if he hadn't gone. And the thing is that I'm not convinced that he was ready to know that Vader was his father at all. He would have saved himself that. He would have continued his training. And I mean, isn't that always like, it's the fact that like we want to believe that Luke is the hero. We want to believe that he's right. But ultimately, there are a lot of moments in Star Wars where the point
he is the hero, but he's wrong.
Exactly. And the point in that moment, which I don't know if like why people don't pick up on this more often, but in that moment, Yoda and Obi-Wan were right.
Mhm. Yeah, they were right. They were right about Luke not he shouldn't leave, that he wasn't ready, and that he was going to fall right into the Vader and the Emperor's trap, to give him information that he wasn't ready for. They were completely right about that. They were, of course, wrong about Darth Vader being redeemable. That was the thing where he showed up, Yoda and Obi-Wan, where he proved that you should not ever give up on somebody, and that he is not more machine now than man. He's still Anakin Skywalker. But of course, the way that this always goes, self-fulfilling prophecy, like Star Wars, and particularly the prequels, is happening during the War on Terror, a time where we're all afraid and we want to go out there and fight the unknown and make sure that we're never hurt ever again. And so the United States builds a security apparatus and security terminals at every airport. The Department of Homeland Security is born from scratch. Most people don't even know that. You ask people that, I polled this actually in my work, like most people think the Department of Homeland Security has been around for 100 years. And like it was born like 20 years ago in the War on Terror, people. And now, of course, you complain about the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security being weaponized and targeting domestic political groups and policing domestic political conversation. Y'all, like, the only people who were warning about this in the early 2000s were civil liberties Democrats and libertarians. Republicans were all on the war train. Corporate Democrats were all on the war train. But the civil liberties crowd and libertarians were all going, y'all, this war on terror thing is going to be a war on us. It's just a matter of when. So, yeah, we're gonna find demons out overseas, or we're gonna find them here. Like, this is what fear does to people. And then there's an alternative vision. Let go. Like, there is an alternative vision, and this is what politicians cannot do, and it's what Anakin could not do. When this is an abstract point, but I'll try to make it. I mean, when Yoda tells him that you have to train yourself to learn to let go of everything that you fear to lose. Imagine a politician telling the parents who are afraid of a school shooter coming to their kid and murdering their children, y'all, you need to learn to let go of the fear of your kids being lost. Imagine how that person's election is going to go if your response to people's fear, which is these are outlier events, right? Like school shootings, they happen a lot and like way too much for us, but they're outlier events in terms of harm that can come to your children. Politicians cannot tell people that. They cannot tell them, actually, your child is probably in the safest place that they could possibly be, which is at a school. That is statistically true, but that is not how politics works. So we've got this choice as a culture to make of whether or not we want to have people tell us the things that we're afraid of is true, or have people tell us tough truths, which is that there's dangerous things in the world, bad things happen, they're not as common as you think, and you need to learn to chill. And live the Jedi way.
I wish that we could understand that more. Like you said, that this pendulum swings back and forth, and that that's a feature of our democratic republic. It's not a bug when we go from conservative to liberal.
Yeah.
That's the whole point. And that the idea of every president is going to be in some way a reaction to the previous president, whether it's someone who's trying to further the previous person's agenda or react against it. And we need to do everything that we can to protect our civil liberties and ensure that we quash rises of authoritarianism, because that's the threat to democracy. The threat to democracy is not the pendulum swinging back and forth as we put these decisions in the hands of the voters.
Yep.
So in your
Now, I was just going to say the tools you give to the powerful today are the tools the powerful will use against you in 20 years. The stuff you cannot predict.
Yeah. So then, in that case, regardless of political allegiance, do you see anyone? Do you see any politicians, in local government, federal government at all? Is there anybody that you admire for these kinds of things? Is there anybody that you recognize as having at least some measure of integrity that you wish other people would take note of?
Oh man, I just want to punt on Obi-Wan Kenobi. She's a politician. They are not to be trusted, and they are not. They are not to be trusted. So the only ones that I can think of are ones that have left office. You have left Congress because they realize it's not a constructive place to do work. I look up to Ben Sass, who's now moving down to the University of Florida, former Republican U.S. Senator. And then, of course, Justin Amash, Republican House member who lost his reelection bid in Michigan and now is just on the outside, just trying to press for reform to the office of Speaker of the House. That's kind of his main political project, is to have Speaker of the House reform. And he's a guy of integrity, and he spends his time discoursing with liberals on the things that they are right on when it comes to civil liberties, and chiding Republicans on all the ways in which they have petty authoritarian instincts. So I would say Amash, and nobody who's in Congress is someone who I look up to.
Wow, that's
Sorry.
oh, it's hard. It's something that, you know, I've never been in a place where I've chosen to pursue political office, but it's
Mhm.
one of those things where it's like, ah, you know, in another life I think I could have done that.
Yeah.
But it's hard. Like I don't know if you can do it. Is it, you know, it doesn't shock me that there have been whole Christian traditions that have completely said you must distance yourself from government and society because it cannot lead to anything good.
No, it's not a kingdom on earth, it's a kingdom in heaven. And you've got this these warring instincts where I think I don't want to de-Star Warsify your Star Wars podcast, but I think the far left, like, progressive project is a utopian heaven on earth project, and then the conservatives, they have a little bit more of an anchor, particularly today, to the church than the progressive movement does, and they say that they are trying to point us towards again, like, tradition, connection with God, life and the afterlife and all that stuff, but like still trying to grab the reins of power in a world that is not meant for godly things, and not meant
Yep.
for the good. And so yeah, I mean, like, you're fighting to preserve something that maybe you should be Brexiting or exiting from this system altogether. I think that's why conservative Christian writer Rod Dreher wrote The Benedict Option, which was, the only thing left for Christians to do is exit society and live in communes. So,
I mean, I'll tell you what, there's something to be said about the idea of kind of, you know, withdrawing, and, you know, maybe we need our own Jedi temple.
yeah, maybe so. And our founding text will be how the Force can fix the world. That will be
Available whenever books are sold.
the organizing scriptures.
Oh, so good. I think that's a good place to wrap up. Alfie, any other thoughts?
Not really. I've just enjoyed listening to you two. It's been great.
This has been such a privilege. I just want to thank you so much. I actually had no idea what kind of conversation we are going to be having tonight. I thought we were going to like gab about the Mandalorian, and I'm just so glad we got to go deep on some of these issues. And I used to host Beltway Banthas for like 4 years, and every episode we did was politics and Star Wars. It didn't matter if we went off the rails for 20 minutes on politics, it would come back to Star Wars, and that was what the show was all about. And I've been thinking about it so much lately. I just miss it, and this was really special. So thank you for like allowing this space to have this conversation. I hope your audience is like forgiving and patient with it as well. I know this can be agitating to some people.
I had listened to your book before the first time you were on, which I had to miss. So I had just really been anticipating listening to you talk about this. That's why I didn't try to jump in so much.
Now you should
I
just listen
really
to Jessica.
enjoyed
She has her act together.
Oh, that's sweet. But I mean, you bring up a good point, and that is the Mandalorian is finally coming back, and this is something that, oh man, I'm so excited. Bo-Katan is finally coming. I'm finally gonna get my
Yep.
Kryze, my
Yep.
Kryze lore. I'm getting Clone Wars era Mandalorians back. I'm so excited.
I can
me too.
tell this is very important.
I'm very excited. But it's been so long. I mean, I just can't believe that, Bo-Katan first showed up in live action in 2020. Yeah, it's been
Mhm.
over 2 years because we had Boba Fett in between that. And I just knew that we were going to have to wait that long. People were like, no. They'll get Boba Fett into production and then they'll do the Mandalorian. I'm like, that's not how this works. They
Nope.
have to get out of production for Boba Fett before they can go to the Mandalorian. So it's been a long time and I'm very excited. So
From what I
Yay.
read today, season 4 shouldn't be nearly as long of a wait. That's already in pre-production.
I mean, I assume that that's the case, especially if they aren't having. I mean, I've heard rumors of another installment of Boba Fett, but I don't know if they would do that between season 3 and 4. Maybe they do season 3 and 4.
What
and
I was
then do
reading
Boba
today
Fett.
is there's a possibility they're both in production right now. 'Cause there is a possibility of a Writers Guild strike this summer,
Oh, great.
and then that is going to be followed by a Directors Guild strike. So whether it's true or not, we never know. But from what I was reading today, they're really trying to get the series pretty far into production in case that does happen.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
never a boring day as a Star Wars fan, is it?
Never. Well, y'all, thanks again for having me on to do this. This was really special. When will this be airing?
I think we get it out pretty quickly. Don't
Yeah,
Cool.
probably tomorrow.
probably comes out tomorrow. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm gonna bounce. Jessica, we have a lot we should talk about. So
I agree.
do you operate through Rule of the Galaxy? Do you have your own Twitter handle or
I have my own Twitter handle. I'm Darksaber Light at Darksaber Light. I used to have a podcast called Stories by Darksaber Light, and
Okay.
that's kind of
Okay.
been put on hold.
Here it is.
But,
Satine Week.
I told you she's my girl.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
But yeah, that's where you can find me. And thanks to all of our listeners. Really appreciate you tuning in. Sure that you all didn't expect to get an hour and a half long conversation on politics and Star Wars, but I hope that you've enjoyed it. Make sure that you send us your thoughts on what you liked, what you didn't like, and if there's any topics or guests that you'd like us to have on. And other than that, we've got The Mandalorian coming up. We've got Bad Batch still going, and so we'll be here in the coming weeks to give you all of our thoughts on that. So have a great night, and may the Force be with you.